Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And it is the first of our 5 positional rankings throughout the week, starting off with the quarterback position. The 4 quarterbacks I've compiled are an interesting amalgamation of QBs, to say the least. I always try and vary it up. These aren't the guys you see in the fantasy rankings week in, week out consistently top them. These are guys who I personally feel either have something to prove, have good matchups, or just have an interesting feeling about in these games. You can take this any way you want. You can immediately eschew it from your mind after the show, but these are my personal fantasy rankings, but I do want to hear your opinions on them if you have any throughout this segment. So without further ado, let's jump into our final segment of the day with my personal fantasy QB rankings. Starting off, let's talk about Kyler Murray a little bit. Obviously, hasn't played this week. He will play tonight against the Chargers. But I do feel like Kyler Murray, to most people, has been very disappointing this season from a fantasy perspective, because we really don't know how to gauge him when the offense has run so hot and cold. But looking at this matchup against the Dolphins, who may have a little glimmer of optimism if it looks like Tua will start. He will practice on Wednesday. But on the other side of the football, Kyler Murray is still someone, as Arnold said, I need to trade Mason ASAP. I know Shanahan is panicking, going to rush CMC back now. I'm not sure. I feel like Kyle Shanahan, here's the thing here, will want to see at least one game from these guys like Pearsall, like Cowing, and maybe even Mason. But I do feel like you're not wrong in thinking that this could be panic mode for the 49ers. I do feel like this match with the Cowboys could potentially be a trap game. I don't think so, just because of how bad the Cowboys have looked. But I do feel like this could be an interesting game to see how Shanahan views those either secondary or third string guys in this one. Maybe he makes Mason stick around for a game or two. I wouldn't necessarily sell Mason as high as some other players around the league in terms of how trades affect them, so to speak. But I do feel like Mason is someone who may still have 1 or 2 good games left in him. But going back to Kyler Murray here, I do feel like this matchup is an interesting one. I do like the Dolphins' defense, if that's something that might be worrying here for this matchup. But at the end of the day, you have to feel like Kyler Murray will have at least a couple games where we see glimpses of what he was doing early in his career. So look for Kyler Murray, maybe potentially tonight, to not have the best game, but he's going to come back with a vengeance. He just feels like someone who's going to amp it up as the season goes on, as he gains more familiarity in this offense. But I do have faith that he will have some good fantasy starts starting off next week in Week 8. And the next guy I want to talk about, we talked about him a little bit, Caleb Williams. Fresh off a bye, fresh back from London, so having time to reacclimatize himself to the American lifestyle. Don't really know how to put it. But going up against the Commanders, now the pressure's taken off his shoulders, as Anderson expecting a Josh Allen legacy game against the Seahawks. Well, here's the thing. I do feel like Josh Allen will have to be the reason why the Bills win this game, just because I think that they've placed a lot of stock in trading for Amari Cooper, in how they can vary. As Anderson said, Seattle is just one of my favorite prop teams to bet against. So I do feel like Josh Allen can have a good game, but it's going to be dependent on, him being as efficient as possible. If he's efficient, then I think that this could potentially be, and I'm not even joking, a blowout. I feel that, Amari Cooper just adds a second dimension to this offense they didn't have before. But, if Seattle can try and keep him in the pocket for when he does throw the football, then maybe, they take away the biggest weapon the Bills have and make it one-dimensional. And even though the Seattle run defense has not been good, James Cook, much to my chagrin, because he's on my fantasy team, has not looked good these past couple of weeks. And Ray Davis has not proved that he was a hidden gem on the waiver wire. So, who knows? But at the end of the day, Josh Allen will always be someone who is a point of contention in betting, in fantasy, in real life. But going back to the Caleb point, I do feel like if, word comes out that Jaden Daniels will not play in this game, then Caleb, a weight will be lifted off his shoulders here. Because just hearing the storylines, hearing all the praise and plaudits Jaden Daniels has gotten leading up to this game, maybe would not have been the best thing. But coming off the bye, who knows? As Andre also asked a question about trying to sell Mason. He's trying to sell him before CMC comes back. Would I be crazy to trade him for B-Rob, Pollard, or Swift? Those kind of running backs? Not far-fetched. Not for nothing. I love what Swift has done the past couple of weeks. It looked like a fantasy bust, to be honest with you, for the first 3 weeks of the season, and then turned into perhaps one of the best running backs in the entire league, at least from a fantasy perspective, over the last several weeks. So, Swift could be a good option. Pollard's an underrated option. Don't know how the Titans' offense is going to look, whether or not Mason Rudolph or Will Levis is the starter. And B-Rob, the thing about him is I love him, especially as a fantasy player, but it's a very crowded running back room in Washington with him, Eckler, and McNichols. So I do like Swift out of all those options if you do want to trade Mason. But I do feel like maybe Shanahan wants to see what he has with these guys. Because look, guys like CMC, Kittle, maybe even Purdy, a couple of years down the road, might not even be there. So he's going to want to look at all the options he drafted, these cheaper options, to really assess what he has going forward. Because the 49ers could come crumbling down real quick, with all the contract situations they have to deal with. And so I do feel like that could be something, if the season goes off the rails for the Niners, that Shanahan wants to look into going forward. But it certainly is an interesting question here. But out of all those running backs that you mentioned, Swift is the guy. I personally love having him now on my fantasy team, whereas before I was dreading each and every single week for him. So he's a nice addition if you do look to add him. Good luck to you in that trade. But the third quarterback I want to talk about here is a guy who you might be a little bit skeptical. Obviously, not looked his best. Looked very rusty, in fact, this season, but potentially had his most efficient game. As Andre said, apparently CMC is eyeing a Week 10 return after the Week 9 bye week. Perfect timing. So yeah, you get 2 more, maybe potentially solid, good games out of Mason, as Andre also thanks me as well. Thank you, my man, for the comments. I do feel like that's the perfect time, because you see Mason, you potentially either drop him before or you try and trade him when people still think he might have value. But who knows? It's definitely an interesting situation there in San Fran. But Trevor Lawrence was someone who I want to talk about here, and he might be a surprising name to hear in these rankings. But what I've seen from Trevor in that one game abroad is that when he has structure and stability in his offense, he starts to trust the game more. I actually think, even though he wasn't a big contributor, having a guy like Evan Engram there really helps the diversity of the Jags offense, because he is their best route runner, but he also opens up a lot of space for the Jaguars to operate on offense, and opened up Brian Thomas Jr. to have a game enough to warrant me putting him as my wide receiver fantasy star of the week. So, if Trevor Lawrence's best traits are revealed, then he could be someone who could be serviceable in fantasy. Yes, it's a tough Packers defense he's going up against this week, but coming back, have him acclimatize again to his body clock and things of that nature, because he did spend 2 weeks in London. That could be a little bit of a problem here. But I do think that Evan Engram could change the game for him, could relax him, just knowing that he has someone who could open up a lot of what he likes best. And maybe it's to his detriment, but maybe it's to his benefit as well. That's the beauty of fantasy football. We never really know. And the last guy also kind of is a little bit of surprise on my list, Aaron Rodgers. And to say his performance last night was bizarre is a little bit of an understatement here. It was a really weird offensive performance overall of the Jets. There were a couple good things about it, like Breece Hall being more involved. And, there were a couple of those Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams connections. But overall, it was less than the sum of its parts. But he's going up against the Patriots team that, really is on the ropes on the defensive side of the football, at the very least. So I feel like give this Jets offense a little bit of time to find its footing, and potentially they can win games like this. I don't know if they're at the level where they can win games against tougher teams, even to try and stay in this AFC East race, but they can at the very least win games like this against the Patriots, and they have a lot of easy games in their schedule. So if there's any sort of optimism there, it's you have perhaps the easiest schedule of any NFL team left, and you have now perhaps one of the best QB wide receiver duos of the past couple of years at your disposal, and you have good secondary options around you to supplement that connection. So that's why I feel like Aaron Rodgers in a couple of these games could be an interesting fantasy asset, even though, a lot of people think that song is ended. But I still think he has a couple good games left in him. But that concludes my, as always, another great show. Have a good rest of your day. Bro, peace. That's Andre. Thank you to you, my man. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been, as always, Christopher Shepard. Thank you to you all for watching. But if you want more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network. Great way to support me and my fellow podcasters who are all great in their own rights. But also, if you want to interact like Andre has done, day one fan, perfect example of this, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Fit Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to contribute and interact with the show. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back, as always, same time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, for another great edition of the show. I'm out.